Hey guys, tonight we dive back into the muddy trenches of World War I. But this time, you're not just a soldier, you're the witness to the gritty, grim daily grind where boredom battles fear in equal measure. Picture yourself squatting in a wet trench, cold seeping through your threadbare uniform, the scent of damp earth mixing with stale tobacco smoke. You probably won't survive the boredom here, let alone the bullets. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time below. It's always wild to see who's joining us from where. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through mud that clings to your boots like a second skin, the trench walls pressing in, a narrow corridor of decay and whispers. This was the daily reality for millions during World War I, where the battlefield stretched into endless zigzags of trenches, pocked with craters and barbed wire, where moments of terror intertwined with stretches of crushing monotony. Life in the trenches wasn't just about dodging bullets or shell fire. It was about enduring the claustrophobic, damp conditions that gnawed at your sanity. Rats the size of your hand scurried across soggy floors, feasting on discarded rations, and worse. The air was thick with the stench of decay, sweat, and unwashed bodies. You'd learn quickly that the enemy wasn't just the opposing army, it was the mud, the lice, and the cold that seeped into your bones. Scientifically speaking, your body would enter a kind of survival mode in this environment. Prolonged exposure to cold and damp triggers your body to constrict blood vessels to preserve core temperature, often leading to trench foot, a nasty, painful condition where your feet swell and rot if left wet for too long. Doctors still debate whether trench foot was aggravated more by bacterial infection or constant moisture, but either way, it was a war within the war. During the lulls in fighting, boredom became its own kind of torment. Soldiers carved boredom relief routines, card games, makeshift concerts, or telling tall tales about the one that got away. Some even reported hallucinations after weeks of trench duty. Probably not the best time to question your sanity. Yet, the camaraderie forged in these moments was intense. The shared misery made brothers out of strangers. A quirky tidbit: some soldiers kept trench journals, underground magazines, written and illustrated by troops themselves, full of dark humor, cartoons, and poems mocking the officers or the war itself. These publications were morale boosters, proof that humor survived even in mud and blood. Scientists still argue whether the mental strain from trench warfare directly influenced the modern understanding of PTSD, then called shell shock. What's clear is the trenches became an incubator for early psychological studies, transforming how we see trauma today. So, next time you feel stuck in a boring meeting, imagine this muddy trench, where every second might mean life or death. But mostly it meant waiting for orders, for relief, or just for the sun to rise through the fog of war. You step out of the trench for a moment, boots squelching in the mud as you survey the no man's land, a blasted wasteland stretching between you and the enemy. The ground looks like it was churned by a giant's restless dreams, shell craters filled with murky water, broken trees stripped of leaves, and tangled barbed wire snaking in every direction. The silence is eerie, broken only by distant artillery thunder like a growling beast far away, promising chaos that could erupt at any moment. Walking this deadly space was like navigating a surreal nightmare. Soldiers had to creep across this open ground, often under fire, hoping the mud wouldn't swallow them whole. The term, no man's land, itself tells you everything. This was territory owned by no one, a gray zone where death could lurk behind any shattered stump or twisted wire. Your senses sharpen as you dodge sharp metal and hidden pitfalls. The air is thick with the scent of cordite from spent shells, and the faint metallic tang of blood. At night, the landscape transforms into a ghostly terrain, under a veil of fog or moonlight, where shadows play tricks and every sound could mean an enemy creeping closer. Interestingly, the physics of artillery shells in this environment reveal something about the science of explosion and shockwaves. When a shell detonates, it sends a supersonic shockwave through the air and ground, causing devastating damage. These shockwaves create secondary effects, like the infamous shell shock. Due to the intense pressure changes impacting the human body, scientists still argue whether the mental trauma was caused more by the physical shockwave or the horrifying experiences themselves. A quirky historical note: some soldiers believe that the craters filled with water could heal wounds if dipped in, probably wishful thinking, but it reflects how desperation breeds strange rituals. Others took to decorating no man's land with tiny crosses or makeshift memorials, a silent rebellion against the chaos. Boredom in the trenches was one thing, but the terror of no man's land was a different beast. Raids into this space were often quick, chaotic affairs, sometimes no more than a few minutes of running and firing before retreating to the muddy safety of the trench. Yet, these brief moments could define lives. So, as you stand there, feeling the cold bite of the wind and the sticky mud underfoot, you realize how this barren zone symbolized the brutal stalemate of the war itself, caught between advance and retreat, hope and despair. You trudge back into the trench, the wooden planks beneath your boots slick with mud and grime. The smell here is a thick mix of damp earth, sweat, and something far less describable, the stench of decay and unwashed bodies that clings to everything around you. Soldiers sit or lie in small groups, some whispering quietly, others just staring into the distance, eyes glazed like fish caught in a net. The trench is a world unto itself, a labyrinthine wound carved into the earth, alive with the murmurs of waiting and the weight of unseen fear. This cramped, grim space is the front line of modern industrial warfare, where millions would live in muddy tunnels just inches from death. The design of trenches was both practical and a grim necessity, deep enough to protect from bullets and shrapnel but claustrophobic enough to crush spirits. You feel the rough wood of the duckboards beneath your feet, meant to keep soldiers from sinking deeper into the mud, though often failing against the relentless wet. Inside, you hear the constant drip of water seeping through the walls, the rattling of sandbags, and the faint scratching of rats that have made the trenches their domain. These rats weren't just pests, they became legendary enemies, growing fat on the remains of fallen soldiers, and sometimes even nibbling on the living. You shudder, recalling how one soldier joked that the rats were the only things thriving in this hellscape. Scientifically, the trench environment was a breeding ground for diseases, trench foot, caused by prolonged exposure to wet and sanitary conditions, led to swelling and even gangrene. Medical science was still catching up, and while treatments improved as the war dragged on, many soldiers suffered horrible fates simply from the environment. Scientists still argue whether trench foot or combat injuries caused more casualties during certain periods. On a lighter, though grimly humorous note, some soldiers fashioned trench art from bullet casings and shell fragments, turning instruments of death into delicate carvings or jewelry. It was a way to reclaim some small control, a quirky human defiance amid chaos. You notice the quiet conversations, the shared cigarettes passed around like treasure, the whispered prayers, and the letters from home read over and over. These small rituals punctuated the endless wait, grounding soldiers in their humanity. Yet, every distant boom reminded you that relief was only temporary. In this muddy corridor of war, you understand how the trenches became a symbol of endurance and despair, the muddy veins pumping lifeblood through a dying world. You climb out of the trench, the chill of the early morning mist settling on your skin like a thin, cold blanket. Above, the battlefield stretches before you, an expanse of churned earth scarred by craters, broken trees, and barbed wire tangled like metallic serpents. The sky is a dull gray, heavy with the threat of rain, but it's the silence that's most unnerving. It's the calm before the storm, the kind of quiet that presses in on you, making every breath feel loud, and every heartbeat a drum of impending dread. As you prepare to move forward, you notice the peculiar shapes of the artillery shells, some painted bright colors, others marked with cryptic symbols. These were the new weapons of industrialized death, capable of leveling entire forests or towns with a single barrage. You can almost hear the distant whistle of an incoming shell, a sound that soldiers would come to dread more than anything else. Scientific advances in artillery technology changed warfare forever. The sheer explosive power unleashed was a testament to industrial might, but also a horrifying testament to human ingenuity and destruction. Interestingly, some of the chemicals used in shells later found peaceful applications, like dyes and medicines. Scientists still argue whether the rapid development of these weapons was an inevitable consequence of industrialization or a preventable spiral fueled by nationalism. You step carefully, boots sinking slightly into the mud, aware of the invisible dangers beneath your feet, landmines, unexploded shells, and the ever-present threat of sniper fire. It's a deadly puzzle, this no man's land, where every step could be your last. Soldiers tried to map it out, but the landscape shifted with each barrage, making navigation a perilous guessing game. There's a strange irony in how nature fought back too. Wild flowers started to bloom in the shell craters, and in some spots, birds seemed oblivious to the destruction below. One quirky observation soldiers made was that glowing fungi sometimes appeared on fallen wood, eerie blue lights in the night, which some whispered were signs of the battlefield's haunted soul. You hear whispered rumors about secret weapons and new tactics, flamethrowers, poison gas, tanks slowly rumbling into view. These innovations were both terrifying and revolutionary. You recall how some troops joked that the war would soon be fought by robots, though that seemed like science fiction back then. As you survey the landscape, you feel the heavy weight of history pressing down. This battlefield is not just mud and wire. It's a crucible where the future of warfare was forged in fire and fear. The sound of distant gunfire hums like a low thunderstorm rolling over the scarred landscape. You trudge forward, every step weighed down by the thick, clinging mud that threatens to suck your boots off if you're not careful. The air is sharp with the scent of damp earth and burning wood, mixed with the metallic tang of spilled blood, though your mind tries to dull that last part, as sleep won't come easy if you dwell too much on it. Around you, the silhouettes of your comrades move like ghosts in the fog, faces smeared with grime, eyes hollow but determined. One of the strangest sights you encounter are the trench rats, enormous, fearless creatures who feast on the detritus of war, sometimes even the fallen. These rats seemed almost to mock the soldiers, surviving the chaos with unnerving success. In fact, during the war, soldiers reported that rats grew so large, some joked they could be ridden like horses, which probably says a lot about their sleep-deprived imagination. Scientists still argue whether these rat populations exploded solely because of the war conditions, or if other ecological factors played a part. Your mind drifts to the new sounds of the war, the clanking of machine guns firing their relentless stream, the sudden, sharp crack of rifles, and the eerie whistles of bombs flying overhead. The machine gun was a terrifying invention, a mechanical beast that could mow down waves of soldiers before they even got close. It was so effective that entire military tactics had to be reconsidered. Ironically, the same principle of rapid firing had been inspired by earlier attempts at mass-producing tools, showing how industrial progress always walks a fine line between creation and destruction. As you navigate the narrow trench corridors, the walls lined with sandbags and splintered wood, you notice the crude carvings etched by soldiers into the beams, names, dates, little drawings of loved ones, or crude jokes to keep spirits up. These tiny acts of humanity, amid the horror, remind you that this war is more than just strategy and technology. It's millions of individual stories tangled in barbed wire. Amid the constant threat, soldiers found solace in small routines, trading letters, sharing rations, or even daring to tell a joke. You hear about the famed trench humor, where gallows humor became a survival mechanism. One favorite was the nickname plum puddings for enemy shells, since they left behind chunks of earth that looked like burnt desserts, a morbid but oddly comforting joke. The war also brought forward fascinating psychological questions. Scientists still argue whether prolonged exposure to the horrors of trench warfare caused permanent brain changes, or if many symptoms were psychosomatic. The term shell shock was coined to describe these effects, an early recognition of what we now understand as PTSD. You pause, imagining the muddy trenches, stretched out beneath the gray sky, a maze of fear, endurance, and fleeting hope. You step out of the trench briefly, the cold air biting your cheeks as you climb over the parapet into no man's land. A desolate expanse of churned-up mud, broken barbed wire, and shattered trees standing like skeletal sentinels. The landscape feels strangely quiet, almost surreal, as if the earth itself is holding its breath. The ground is littered with the debris of battle, spent shells, discarded rifles, and the eerie remnants of uniforms, sometimes caught on wire like forgotten flags. Here, in this blasted zone, the war's relentless machinery is on full display. The creeping, calculated destruction of artillery barrages is as much a psychological weapon as a physical one. You hear that scientists have measured how repeated concussive blasts could alter brain function, a grim reminder of how technology was shaping not just bodies, but minds. While the trenches were grim, no man's land was an even crueler no man's place, an expanse that swallowed soldiers whole, where survival often hinged on the briefest moments of courage or sheer luck. The mud here could be a grave. Soldiers sometimes joked it was the worst graveyard ever, and it's not hard to see why. It clings, it pulls, and if you fell, you risked being trapped like a creature caught in a spider's web. Amid this bleakness, there's an odd phenomenon called trench art. Soldiers fashioned objects from shell casings, buttons, and bones. It's a curious human impulse to create beauty and meaning from destruction. One soldier carved an entire chess set from wood scavenged on the battlefield, an island of strategy and distraction amid chaos. And while the war was dominated by the massive industrial powers, scientists still argue about the effectiveness of the creeping barrage tactic, where artillery fire moved just ahead of advancing infantry. Did it truly protect soldiers, or did it sometimes cause more confusion and casualties? The debates rage on, much like the battles themselves. You imagine the terrifying advance across no man's land during an offensive, soldiers bursting from trenches, running under a hailstorm of bullets, barbed wire snagging clothes and flesh alike. It's a dance with death choreographed by strategy and desperation. The sky above sometimes glows with flares and tracer bullets, painting the night with eerie light. This shattered earth is more than just a battlefield. It's a silent witness to courage, fear, and the strange, stubborn resilience of those caught in the machine of war. The cold seeps into your bones as you linger at the edge of the shattered no man's land, watching the distant flashes of artillery light up the night sky like some grim fireworks display nobody asked for. It's hard to imagine, but beneath all this destruction, armies on both sides began to dig deeper, not just in trenches, but into tunnels and bunkers that stretched for miles beneath the earth. These subterranean networks were a whole new battlefield, a shadow war of claustrophobic passages and deadly encounters in near total darkness. You can almost hear the eerie silence down there, punctuated only by the occasional scrape of a shovel or the muffled whisper of soldiers trying to listen for enemy digging. The practice of tunneling under enemy lines, then detonating massive explosives to blow up their positions, was both ingenious and terrifying, a literal game of cat and mouse underground. Scientists still argue whether these underground strategies prolonged the war, or just added another layer of horror to an already hellish conflict. The tunnels could collapse without warning, and the air was thick with dust and the faint scent of explosives. Many soldiers suffered from casein disease, or decompression sickness, a little-known affliction caused by the rapid changes in air pressure while working underground. It's a strange and often overlooked piece of World War's medical puzzle, how the environment itself became an enemy. One quirky fact that often surprises people is that some soldiers used carrier pigeons to send messages between trenches and command posts. These birds were decorated like tiny war heroes, and their reliability was so highly valued that a pigeon named Sherami famously saved nearly 200 soldiers by delivering a critical message despite being wounded. It's a reminder that even in a mechanized war, nature found its role. As you imagine crawling through those dark, narrow tunnels, you realize that this invisible underworld was a perfect metaphor for the war itself. Hidden struggles beneath a surface already scarred and chaotic. The bravery required to venture into such darkness, not knowing if death or discovery awaited, is staggering. With every step, the war stretches deeper, not just across continents, but beneath the very ground you walk on. You find yourself back on the surface, trudging through muddy trenches now slick with rain, as the dawn breaks with the faint gray light seeping through low clouds. The world around you feels like a painting smeared by mud and smoke, the air thick with a mix of damp earth and something less tangible, fear, exhaustion, and a strange kind of resignation. The morning is supposed to bring a fresh start, but in this war, dawn often just means the next round of relentless shelling. Around you, the soldiers are quiet, their faces gaunt and eyes hollow but alert. The constant threat of a gas attack hangs like a shadow over everything. Mustard gas and chlorine, those cruel inventions of chemical warfare, have changed the rules completely. The chemical agents can burn skin, damage lungs, and blind victims, turning the battlefield into a toxic nightmare. Scientists have long debated the ethics and long-term effects of chemical weapons, with many agreeing this marked a chilling turning point in modern warfare. You notice soldiers fumbling with their gas masks, those awkward, bulky devices that have become an essential, if uncomfortable, part of their gear. The mask's strange rubbery smell mixes with the ever-present scent of damp wool and metal. It's odd to think that a simple mask could mean the difference between life and a painful, slow death, technology so basic yet so vital. On a lighter note, amidst this grim setting, soldiers sometimes carve tiny gas mask figurines from bits of scrap metal, odd keepsakes that oddly humanize the harshness. It's almost as if these tokens help them cope, a small rebellion against the impersonal machinery of war. Scientists still argue about how much gas actually influenced battle outcomes versus the psychological terror it induced. Did the fear of gas sometimes cause more strategic retreat than the actual physical damage? It's a question historians and chemists debate while the ghosts of those attacks linger in memories and stories. You inhale deeply, feeling the chill and the dampness cling to your skin, imagining what it must have been like to hold your breath, don that mask, and charge forward knowing the invisible enemy could strike at any moment. It's a cruel game of survival, in a world transformed by chemicals and fear. The roar of artillery fades into a distant thunder, as you step closer to the sprawling, muddy mess of a battlefield littered with tangled barbed wire, and the remnants of hastily abandoned trenches. It's here that you truly grasp the brutality of trench warfare, the endless back and forth, the grim stalemate that sucked the life out of so many young souls. You trudge through the wet earth, your boots squelching, the smell of decay and gunpowder thick in the air, a cocktail of death that lingers long after the guns fall silent. Trench warfare was less about glory and more about endurance. You squeeze into narrow, rat-infested ditches that offer little protection, but a whole lot of misery. Soldiers learn to live with the constant drip of water, the ever-present mud that seeped into everything, and the buzzing chorus of flies attracted to the unfortunate. Scientists still argue whether trench conditions themselves caused more casualties than the bullets and shells. The unsanitary environment bred diseases like trench foot, a nasty fungal infection that could lead to gangrene and amputation if untreated. One quirky fact is that some soldiers turn to trench art, crafting intricate sculptures and objects from spent shell casings and scraps of metal. These little pieces of creativity amid chaos offered a brief escape and a way to hold on to humanity when everything else seemed lost. You might chuckle thinking about the absurdity of these miniature works of art, existing in such a gruesome place. It's a strange blend of destruction and creation, a reminder that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can find a flicker of light. Imagine, too, the psychological toll, the shell shock. What we now recognize as PTSD began to emerge as soldiers faced unending stress and trauma. Scientists still debate how much this invisible wound shaped the future understanding of mental health in combat. As you stand there, surrounded by the echoes of battles long gone, you can almost feel the weight of the countless stories buried beneath your feet, stories of fear, hope, loss, and a stubborn will to survive. You find yourself shifting away from the trenches, stepping into the eerie silence of the no man's land that stretches between opposing forces like a scar on the earth. This barren expanse is a wasteland of shattered trees, craters filled with stagnant water, and the occasional remnants of a soldier's kit half buried in the mud. It's a place where nature and war collide in an unsettling way. Shell holes have become tiny ponds where frogs croak, and wildflowers stubbornly bloom amidst the ruins, defying the devastation. As you carefully navigate this ghostly terrain, your senses heighten. The smell of damp earth mixed with the metallic tang of leftover explosives lingers. You notice the tiny glint of a spent bullet embedded in a tree stump, and the faint echo of distant artillery. This is no man's land, a name as ominous as its reality, deadly, desolate, and terrifyingly quiet between bouts of violence. Scientists still argue whether no man's land was more psychologically damaging than the trenches. The constant threat of snipers, mines, and sudden attacks kept soldiers on edge, turning this stretch into a deadly limbo, where stepping the wrong way meant instant death. You might picture the soldiers' mix of dread and numbness as they crossed this land, a perilous journey of inches that could change the course of a battle or end it altogether. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. During quieter moments, some soldiers would carve messages or doodles into the trees and rocks of no man's land, a kind of eerie graffiti left for whoever might come after. It's a strange way to claim a tiny piece of a place that belongs to no one yet controls everything. Remember, the no man's land wasn't just a physical barrier, but a symbol of the war's futility. Two sides locked in a deadly standstill, neither gaining ground, both losing hope. Your feet sink slightly in the mud as you consider the silence here, a silence that's almost louder than any gunfire, echoing with the ghosts of those who crossed this ground long ago. You move forward, leaving no man's land behind, stepping into the chaos of the artillery barrage that defines much of this war. The ground shakes beneath your feet as shells explode in rhythmic thuds, sending up clouds of smoke and dirt. The sound is deafening, a brutal, mechanical roar that never quite lets up. You can almost taste the dust in the air, gritty and heavy, clinging to your tongue as if war itself is inhaled with every breath. Artillery was the king of the battlefield, capable of leveling entire villages and reshaping landscapes. Imagine the logistics: miles of trenches, endless supplies of shells, and men racing to reload massive guns under constant threat. Scientists still argue whether artillery was the single most decisive factor in World War's staggering casualties, but there's no doubt it defined the war's character. Here's a quirky fact: some shells were even filled with chemicals, like tear gas or chlorine, marking one of the first times chemical warfare entered the modern arsenal. Soldiers had to scramble for makeshift gas masks, often little more than soaked cloths pressed against their faces. The mental toll was immense, as you imagine the slow, creeping fear of invisible enemies. The landscape itself transformed under artillery fire. A once familiar countryside turned into a moonscape of craters and twisted metal. This constant bombardment wore down not only the land, but the spirits of the men who endured it, blending exhaustion with the surrealness of living amidst such destruction. You trudge through this pulverized earth, the weight of history pressing down as you try to imagine what it felt like to be there. Heart pounding, ears ringing, every moment a fight to survive against a mechanical force that seemed both endless and indifferent. You stumble onward, now deep inside the tangled web of trench warfare, an endless maze of mud, wood, and wire. The smell is a thick mix of damp earth, sweat, and something darker, almost unplaceable but unmistakably present: the stench of decay and desperation. It clings to your clothes and skin like a second layer, impossible to shake off. Trenches were the defining feature of World War I, stretching for hundreds of miles across the Western Front. They offered protection, yes, but also became prisons. Imagine the claustrophobia: narrow, cramped spaces, where you sleep inches from comrades, the constant drip of water, the cold that seeps into your bones. Scientists still argue whether the psychological damage of trench life contributed more to casualties than the bullets and shells themselves. One quirky tidbit soldiers used to fashion trench art from spent shell casings and scrap metal, turning instruments of war into delicate carvings and jewelry. A small attempt at normalcy, or maybe just a way to pass the endless hours of waiting. Communication in trenches was a nightmare. Runners, pigeons, and primitive telephones carried messages, but the fog of war often garbled orders, leading to confusion and tragic mistakes. The wire entanglements out front served as both a defense and a deadly trap for anyone foolish enough to cross. You imagine yourself lying low in the mud, the distant whistle of incoming shells making your pulse race. Every step outside the trench is a calculated risk, each patrol a brush with death. Yet amidst the horror, moments of camaraderie and humor flicker, soldiers swapping stories, sharing rations, laughing at the absurdity of it all. And just when you think the trenches couldn't get any worse, there's always the weather. Rain turning trenches into quagmires, winter biting through the thin uniforms, summer bringing swarms of lice and rats as big as cats. The war didn't just attack the body, it broke the spirit, bit by bit. You trudge forward, now following the muddy trails to the front lines, where artillery roars like thunder, shaking the very ground beneath your feet. The sheer scale of bombardment during World War I was unlike anything before it. Guns that could fire shells weighing hundreds of pounds, exploding with enough force to level entire villages, became the grim symphony of this conflict. Scientists still argue whether the sheer intensity of artillery caused more psychological trauma than the actual combat itself. Picture the sky filled with thick smoke, orange flashes, and the whistle of shells zooming past your ears. The earth trembles with every blast, sending clouds of dirt and debris into the air, mingling with the acrid smell of gunpowder. You probably won't survive this without feeling your heart hammering against your ribs like a trapped bird. One quirky tidbit that might surprise you: soldiers sometimes decorated their helmets with personal charms, or painted them in bizarre designs to mock the seriousness around them, like tiny rebellious art pieces amid destruction. It was a silent way to hold on to individuality, when everything else seemed designed to strip it away. Communication and coordination amid this chaos were incredibly challenging. The introduction of new technologies, like the creeping barrage, where artillery fire moved forward in timed waves just ahead of advancing infantry, required precise timing and nerves of steel. But even then, friendly fire and miscommunication were tragically common. The psychological strain was immense, leading to what was then called shell shock, a term that barely scratched the surface of the trauma soldiers endured. Scientists still debate the full causes and best treatments, but what's clear is that war was not just fought on fields but inside minds. Through all this, you notice a strange contrast: the terrifying noise outside and the eerie silence when the guns momentarily cease. In those brief moments, you can hear the faint sounds of nature, birds cautiously resuming their song, the rustle of leaves, and the distant cries of men. You press onward, sinking deeper into the labyrinth of trenches that scar the landscape like giant wounds. These narrow, muddy corridors are lined with wooden planks, barbed wire, and the occasional flicker of a candle struggling against the damp gloom. The trench system wasn't just a defensive measure, it was a world unto itself, with its own rhythms, dangers, and strange rituals. Scientific fact time: the water in these trenches often reached ankle deep, sometimes higher, creating a perfect breeding ground for trench foot, a painful condition caused by prolonged exposure to damp and sanitary conditions. Soldiers had to change their socks regularly, or risk their feet literally rotting away. Imagine that, a foot slowly giving up on life, all while you try to stay alert for the next barrage. And here's a quirky tidbit to keep spirits up: some troops formed what could only be described as trench theater companies, putting on plays and comedy sketches with whatever scraps they had. Makeshift stages emerged between sandbags, and despite the omnipresent threat of death, laughter sometimes echoed through the mud. Scientists still argue whether the trench lifestyle was more punishing physically or psychologically. The constant noise, the stench of decay, and the endless waiting turned men into shadows of themselves. Rats, Giant, brazen creatures that feasted on leftovers and the fallen were an ever-present menace. Some soldiers joked they were the real victors of the war, growing fat on the spoils of human misery. Amid this, you learn to appreciate the small moments, a shared cigarette, a letter from home, the rare sight of sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. These glimpses of normalcy remind you that beneath the mud and fear, you're still human. As you trudge through this grim world, remember that the war wasn't just fought with guns and shells. It was a battle for endurance, willpower, and the hope that someday, this hellish landscape would give way to peace. You keep moving forward, sensing that the war's end is still a distant, hazy dream, as endless as the barbed wire stretching across the horizon. The soldiers' lives are punctuated by artillery blasts that shake the very earth beneath your feet, and the acrid smell of cordite fills the air. You notice how even the sky seems subdued, heavy with gray clouds that mirror the somber mood of the front. A fascinating scientific fact: the sheer magnitude of artillery fire during World War I was unprecedented, with over 1.5 million shells fired in some major battles. The concussive force could shatter eardrums, cause brain trauma, and churn the soil into a barren moonscape. This relentless bombardment reshaped not only the land, but the minds of those who endured it. Here's a quirky and somewhat bizarre tidbit. During lulls in fighting, some soldiers took up trench art, crafting intricate items like jewelry, cigarette cases, and figurines from shell casings and other scrap materials. These trinkets became cherished tokens, reminders of life beyond the trenches, and proof that creativity can bloom even in the darkest places. Scholars still debate the true psychological impact of trench warfare on soldiers, with some suggesting that the constant stress led to what we now call PTSD, while others argue that camaraderie and routine provided a surprising amount of mental resilience. Either way, the trench was a crucible where the human spirit was tested to its limits. You find yourself reflecting on how this war changed everything: the nature of combat, society's view of heroism, and the very fabric of nations. It was a brutal teacher, offering harsh lessons about technology, politics, and the cost of conflict. As you prepare to leave this muddy world behind, the images linger: the endless trenches, the flicker of hope amid despair, the resilience of those who fought. The war's echoes remain, reminding you of the fragile line between destruction and survival. You feel the heavy weight of silence settle over the battlefield as the guns finally fall quiet. The war that tore through so many lives, landscapes, and futures has drawn to a close, not with a triumphant cheer, but a weary sigh. The armistice, signed on that chilly November morning in 1918, marks the fragile hope for peace, a pause after years of relentless suffering. As the dawn breaks, you notice the battered soldiers emerging from their trenches, ice-glazed but searching for home, for family, for a life beyond the endless mud. The ground beneath them, once alive with the chaos of battle, now holds the stories of sacrifice and endurance etched deep into its soil. Science tells us that the trauma of this great war reshaped not only geopolitics but also our understanding of human psychology and resilience. The scars, visible and invisible, remind us that peace is not simply the absence of war, but the presence of healing. And here's a curious fact to ponder as you drift away. Some historians argue that the very innovations designed to end this war, tanks, airplanes, chemical weapons, set the stage for even greater conflicts. Scientists still debate whether the lessons learned were enough to prevent future devastation, or if history was doomed to repeat itself. So as you close your eyes tonight, imagine the quiet fields, where once stood armies, now blossoming with new life. Let the memories of those who endured this chapter gently fade into peaceful dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.